Gentlemen, who wants to be an ARC trooper?
I do, sir.
You have to pass your final test first. I want you to meet Commander Colt of the Rancor Battalion.
I want you troopers to remember, we're shoulder to shoulder on those front lines. Brothers! And sometimes we may quarrel, but no matter what, we are united. Rule 1, we fight together. So who's ready to step up first?
What are we gonna do?
A separatist victory means death for all of us. The cadet is right. What are we gonna do?
We fight.
But our training's not finished.
Look around. We're one and the same. Same heart, same blood. Your training is in your blood. And my blood's boiling for a fight.
This is our home. This is our war.
What about weapons?
The armory. It's just a few corridors away, here in the barracks. I can retrieve all the firepower that we need. So, who wants to blast some droids?
Hi everyone, welcome once again to Geekfest Rants. My name is Carlos Perone, and today joining me is James. Say hi, James.
Hi everybody.
Today's topic is going to be an examination of the evolution of the Clone Trooper from Star Wars to Clone Wars, or more like from Clone Wars to Star Wars, depending on how you see these films or these TV shows. We're going to go a little bit into the background of exactly how were these characters made, what are the influences in terms of the background, obviously George Lucas's thoughts and what we think are his political beliefs, let's say, and how it affects his storytelling. And also, by the time that we actually get to the original films, the original trilogy, what most of us have met them as stormtroopers, we always were debating, are these the exact same type of characters that we're seeing as clones, or are these different type of characters? Are these recruits? Are these volunteers? Are these all kinds of different races who comprise of this new army that we see by the time of Star Wars, Empire, and Jedi? Because right now we are trying to fill in this gap between these two trilogies, and all we have to go on is expanded universe, character guides, whatever little tidbits we get from the TV show, and whatever little tidbits hopefully we'll get from any future TV show if they ever arrive. So let's start a little bit in the past in terms of the Stormtrooper, first of all, evolved from the original Star Wars script. From what I remember from reading some of these making of books, they really didn't go into too much crazy detail in terms of the origin of the Stormtrooper. The Stormtrooper was really your basic, generic, bad guy army thug. The history wasn't that wide back then. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think they started out almost like just a generic army, samurai-like in some of the drawings and things like that, and they were the generic samurai type with the helmets, and then they evolved into more fiercer-looking, the plastic or plexi helmets, whatever they're made out of. Or their lineage was alleged to be maybe from a super trooper type thing, which is kind of like the Boba Fett thing, and maybe this was a derivative of that type of character. So I imagine what we were just supposed to expect is these are the bad guys, and they're led by this bad guy who happened to be Darth Vader in the first movie. We really didn't know, any backstory in the hierarchy of the Empire or anything.
I remember when I first saw Star Wars, one of the first things that I thought and started wondering is, are these robots? Because you didn't see any hands or heads. You just saw these white, not mechanical, but very robotic, structured beings, and the bad guys all seem to be robotic-ish looking guys. But then, you kind of get especially after Luke puts on the costume and they're chit-chatting and this, okay, they're not robots.
But even
there
then,
was not
you
much...
don't see where they come from. You hear them knocking something out. But in my mind, I feel they were just these mindless, they were programmed in some way to do their job. They weren't a traditional, like an American military man.
First of all, with a name like Stormtrooper, you're supposed to have a reference point.
It brings back the Nazi type era.
A very disciplined, I'm just following orders type of soldier that will do whatever is told without thinking. And that's, I guess, what we're supposed to be shown of what we're dealing with here. But like I said before, yes, at some point you do see like officers or admirals or other rank that are human beings, and you're like, okay, well, there are some humans. These guys, I'm not sure what they are, but then you kind of get it that that's what they are. But they purposely don't give you much into the background of who are these characters. You do hear about Luke and his friends, applying for the academy. I guess it's the Naval Academy or the Space Academy or some kind of Imperial Academy. So you figure that, all right, there is something happening where people are joining and being taught certain things like a traditional army scenario, but you're still wondering, well, can these guys train to be stormtroopers?
Well, that's a good question because, maybe you didn't notice it the first time you saw the movie, maybe not either the fifth time you saw the movie. But I mentioned hierarchy and you mentioned there's officers. They're humans. They're individual faces. It's not like they clearly weren't clones based on what we saw.
Right.
I mean, I guess they could have, but we saw different faces. But do you graduate from infantrymen, which would be the ranks of the stormtrooper? They were probably stormtrooper Marines because we've seen all this stuff down the line. But assuming there were other snowtroopers, pilots, things like that, did you graduate? Did you get promoted to lieutenant or the admiral or something? And my guess is probably not. My guess is probably there was an infantry, you were drafted, which is what we're going to talk about. Were you drafted? Were you born? Were you designed in a tube?
And there are a lot of characters that we do meet. They're very minor characters, especially in Star Wars at the Death Star. You see these older general admiral looking guys, and specifically,
and it turns out one of them
is a character that we see in Clone Wars. You figure, well, these guys look like career military people, so you figure they've been around for a long time. They've seen a lot of stuff, and they must have belonged to some kind of a military-looking thing before the Empire became whatever the Empire was. But let's take a step way back and try to figure out what influences are there when it comes to the type of story you're being told, specifically the type of, not so much the politics, but the structure that you're dealing with as far as the military goes in George Lucas. Now, we both read probably every biography, every article about Lucas's upbringing, his current views, and what impression do you get as far as the picture that Lucas is painting? But again, you got to remember, he painted the original trilogy picture first. What we're getting now is backstory. But it's still the same
slightly
view.
Revisionist, obviously.
Right, but it's still the same political view in terms of you're dealing with a world that is different than it is today, but it's kind of, I don't want to say similar, but it had a vibe of the late 60s, which is where Lucas grew up.
Yeah, I would bet, based on what I've read, and maybe more than a bet, I would almost say for sure, his parents were conservative-minded. And conservative and liberal and things like that were a little different back in the 40s, 50s, 60s, even 70s. That's probably where it changed. We'll call his parents more traditional. I know from what I read, his father didn't look kindly on him going into film and things like that. Kind of want them to have more of a traditional type job.
Work with him at the store or become a businessman or something.
And George, my opinion is, was more of a rebel, and which is at the times, when he grew up, there was that type of, he was into cars, fast, speed, more artistic stuff, films, which is obviously something that is, get your mind out there, you have a different worlds. So, and of the time of Vietnam, which is when he was in school and finishing school.
Right, but you got to also remember his earlier years were more of like what you call the golden age in terms of it's the late 50s, it's the happy days, time where politically the country's still kind of running high on the results of World War II.
Most people are like, most people like Ike. But I think the youth are a little, the rise of the middle class, suburbia, everybody, what is it, 2-car garage and a pot in every belly or something like that, a chicken in every oven or something like that. It was the end of that traditional time. They were stepping into the 60s and things were looking bizarre because you had the conservative traditional butting heads with the youth,
liberal
which
new
would be
youth,
the liberal, and
which was the 60s.
Racial tension.
Sexual, drugs, everything getting smashed, and he lived in California.
Now, even though I feel he would lean more liberal, I would think, and more anti-war and things like that, I don't think he was a type that was into drugs. I think he was more nerdy and more into wanting to, like I said, when he went to film school, was more artistic. So this wasn't a man who had a real agenda. Right. He had a point of view, I'll bet.
But his
I don't think his real political convictions, if there even are any, and we could debate that later on, they didn't come out yet. This was just a time where he was focused on trying to make stories that he
Right.
felt strongly about. And some
However,
of them did have slight political
in
bend.
college, when he started actually going full force with films like THX 1138, it's a very oppressive, futuristic government, militaristic.
Fascism, perhaps.
They're controlling every, like 1984-ish type of vibe. That's what he did there. When he moved on to something like, let's say, American Graffiti, that was taking a step back of a more traditional,
These are the
fun,
times that were fun and
humor,
easy.
and things are good. There was no, the Vietnam vibe wasn't still in
Even
those
the bad
films.
guys in American Graffiti were kind of just like
Good old
street
boys.
toughs.
Yeah,
you know what I
and they
mean?
were
They
like-
weren't. You didn't get the impression they were like dealing heroin or anything crazy like that.
But at the same time, you got to also remember that he's hooked on now with Coppola and some of his film school buddies who are trying to form their own studio. And it's a, FU to the man, meaning the traditional Hollywood studio
the guys
system.
he hung out with were they were rebels in a sense.
They weren't necessarily hippies, but they were like they were that hippie crowd, the
Brian De
independent
Palma,
filmmakers.
Coppola,
Scorsese.
They were probably not crazy, leftists or anything like that, but they were a little different than what the studios were doing, which would be considered the establishment.
It was the beginning of the independent film movement, and he carved out his own little niche. Granted, he didn't take, the route of something like an Easy Rider, but that was the type of environment he was in. It was, first of all, it's California, San Francisco, that kind of a crowd, very free-thinking, experimental, and as a matter of fact, at one point, he was going to direct Apocalypse Now, another gigantic, what you could call anti-war film.
It had a different feeling back when he was involved with it.
Right. He was more...
It was more run and gun type thing rather than
But because of
exposition.
events, scheduling and financing and this and the other, he kind of let Coppola do that, and then he kind of ran with a different idea of his, which was this thing he had been working on for a while called Star Wars, that did have the political background based on the late 60s, early 70s.
It's hard to even pin it down based on things you read because it's a product of the Vietnam era, for sure, but then it's got elements of the American Revolution. It's got elements of the various British European type wars that, had gone on historically. So he didn't take exactly the World War II footage. The flying was more of the Japanese American air.
Right, but that was more style. In other words, he liked the style of traditional war films.
Yeah.
He loves the
But that's what I'm saying.
Tora type of...
I don't think his initial feel was like, this is going to be my little way to be anti-Vietnam.
No, he
or
wasn't going to do...
anti-war.
That's the whole thing. He wasn't going to do Apocalypse Now, but his story still had to have some kind of an undercurrent. And if you think about it, from the point of view of Luke Skywalker, he's just a kid who's minding his own business. He knows there's something weird happening. He doesn't want to get involved with all that war stuff. He just wants to kind of stay and do his thing.
He wants to go to the academy.
Hang out with his friends, because the academy is his
cool.
friends.
It's considered cool because his friend Biggs went to it, and probably some other
but
people he knew.
He's very reluctant to get involved in the big picture. And that, in a way, was a lot of the conflict of the 60s and 70s.
And a lot like George. Like, he wasn't really involved. Like I said, he wasn't a complete anti-war hippie, and he wasn't, let's go and
But
kick
you
their
still
ass.
had those same pressures of you're either for the war or you're against the war. You can't be in the middle. So
And this is where
that's where Luke is stuck.
And this is my thing about, by its very nature, Star Wars. It's focused on conflict, the galactic war. And I'm not talking about the prequels and the Clone Wars stuff. I'm still talking about the stuff we grew up on.
Plus, you got to remember, his purpose wasn't political. His purpose was
To
myth.
tell a story,
He
yes.
wanted to go back to myth and the way that
Good
stories were
versus
told in the
evil.
past, allegories, archetypes, those type of characters that are transcendent to most cultures that you could say, yeah, that, I get it. That's the good guy. He's trying to do something good. That's the bad guy. So that was his main purpose.
Each of the characters in A New Hope, they fit a particular style, particular archetype. Luke, he was an innocent. Han Solo was a conflicted, he was a bit of a rogue, could go either way. Darth Vader was clearly the bad guy. Ben Kenobi was the old warrior, the guy who's done stuff. And the princess was obviously, you could call her the damsel in distress, but she actually was more than that in A New Hope.
Now, in the original films, once again, we know very little about the creation of the Empire and the structure of the Empire.
There.
We know from Ben of how Vader kind of became Vader, but we also kind of have a little backstory of how the Emperor went from being a senator to a ruler of an empire. Not so much from Obi-Wan in the movie, but in the book we're told about there's this guy whose name used to be Palpatine, who was a very popular senator, who somehow finagled his way into becoming emperor and took over and blah, 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 and with his army. But we still don't have the details. Now, with Clone Wars and with the prequels, we're giving the background. And the background that we know, it's a little sketchy and it's a little sudden. In other words, the first thing we ever know about something called a clone trooper, keep in mind, it's the Clone Wars. So, at first you're like, what the hell is a Clone War? What is it? Clones fighting clones? People don't know who they are. They think they're someone else. But it's nothing like that. It's just he decided at some point, I guess, that Clone Wars meant an army of clones fighting something else.
Well, my first exposure to the clones and the Clone Wars was when Star Wars A New Hope first came out. There was even before the fan clubs and any of these online, obviously there was nothing, there was what they call a Star Wars monthly magazine. And it was as much gospel as it could be. It was probably more of a promotional piece from a combination of 20th Century Fox promotional and Lucasfilm, and let's put out stuff but a lot of those issues had real stuff from Lucas and the people who were involved. Some would talk about model making and how they made the movie, and some would talk about how they created the characters. And there's a specific section of one that I have that talks about what is a Stormtrooper. And they said they were clones. It says this. Now, at the time, that may have been what the gospel was, that the Stormtroopers were clones. And like we've said, we think by this era, they weren't all clones based on what we know now. But it was easy to believe that back then. Like we said, they're all in white. They all seem like relatively mindless. Nobody is off on their own. They're not showing them doing anything exemplary. They're fighting the battle that they're told to fight. And our heroes are the ones who are, dictating the events.
Well, as far as the movies go, if you look at them in chronological order, we find out on Attack of the Clones, properly named, obviously, that somewhere in the plan of the Emperor, Palpatine at the time, Darth Sidious at the time, same character, obviously, no big spoiler there, he had ordered somebody to place an order. That's a little
vague. I still would like to know exactly who this Cypher Diaz is.
Cypher Diaz seems to maybe be
code name or something.
It could be Dooku. It could be someone else.
Some patsy.
To place the order for these clones on these cloning facilities, these people, the Kaminoans, to start producing this army, and they just start doing it covertly, quietly. They're doing it, and by the time we get to that second film, it's like, okay, we're ready to deliver our product. Here's your clone army.
And there's a lot of them.
And you're like, whoa, wait,
it's about 10 years, kind of.
Right.
And that's an interesting thing, too. From creation in the tube, which they kind of show, to full-grown, ready-for-battle specimens, it seemed to be about 8 to 10 years, let's say, from when they placed the order.
They talk about accelerated growth. One source that I read says that it's double the time. So in other words, if you normally live to be, let's say, 80 years old, you're going to probably die at 40, which means these clones in 10 years or less.
That's a good impression, because if they made them in 10, they seem to be about 20, which is the average fighting age.
They could be ready to be late
young
teenagers, early 20s, and they're ready to fight. So that's the time span you're dealing with. So they're creating these clones. They're ready to go by the time this film comes out. And obviously, story-wise, it coincides where, holy crap, the Republic needs an army now. Hey, look what we got over here. And it's unusual that they don't question the source at all.
That's what I was going to say just now.
They just say, we need them, let's take them, and let's use them.
Nobody seems to be concerned that, wait a minute.
Who the hell ordered this?
Okay, good, they're here, and we have this whole army. They've got ships, capital ships. Nobody noticed the diversion of funds or anything, assuming it's real politics. But then all of a sudden, then it's like, the Jedi seem on board. And we don't really know that until we see the Clone Wars animated series. But they're in full fighting mode by the beginning of Revenge of the Sith. So it's obviously the Jedi are on board with these clones fighting side by side. They seem to have relationships. Obi-Wan seems to have a relationship with Cody.
But you figure there would be some massive investigation going on into where these things came from.
And if it's there, and I think that's the explanation, there's corruption. There's, a lot of backhanded stuff. There's a lot of money.
And it's kind of like, we need to fight. We don't have time to investigate. We just need to deploy troops.
It doesn't seem like something, and this is my problem with the Jedi, which we'll do in another show perhaps. The Jedi are not all-knowing and all-seeing, but they're supposed to be relatively advanced and be able to pick up tremors in the Force or evil among them. But it seems to be they were so blinded, and I'd like to go into an episode with that sometime to how could that have happened.
The quick explanation is there's a disturbance in the Force. Things are clouded.
Yeah, clouded.
The visions are clouded.
Yeah,
okay.
But meanwhile, it's so clouded that 500,000 troops are being built. Like I said, capital ships are being built. There's all types of resources. But the Jedi it was off.
Well, that's something
it's like off in Siberia.
That's something no one has explained it yet. And that is, does this ordering of the clones also mean the building of an infrastructure for these clones? Or is the infrastructure
they're all there? It's all there. When you see them, when they're finally
all the
ready.
Ships,
when they're finally called upon
ships.
to engage in the battle, they're entering these ships. There's all kinds of equipment, like the precursors to the AT-ATs, the AT-TE. They're all being maneuvered into these big pre-Star Destroyers,
So
cruisers.
they have to learn to use those things, so they must be training on them. They might not necessarily have them, but that's part of the story itself. And again, this goes back to the politics, is that Lucas also introduces the idea of the military-industrial complex, whereby all you got to do is show some cash, and these companies are ready to give you everything you need.
Here's another scenario. Are we to assume these are ships that are being built or are there for generic Jedi, or are these ships that are there or ready to be used for the armies that are already established? I don't think so, because these seem newer. These seem more clone trooper centric.
Right.
And so they just come out of nowhere. So, but again, at the very end of Attack of the Clones, you see the look of failure on the face of Bail Organa, the character. You can see him punch the concrete overhang that they're all observing this clone army being assembled. But nobody seems to be questioning, how did this happen? At least Padme, by the end of the thing, says, well, this is how Liberty dies, with thunderous applause.
And I guess
so she seems to be, at least, they have a feeling of this is wrong. Some of them eventually get that, but we don't get to see that.
We
sadly.
don't get that, and I think once again the implication or the message you're being given is that in the rush to war, the frenzy of war, you don't care where things are coming from as long as you're there.
And
so
in
it's
our lifetime, we've seen that. But whether you're on the right or the left politically, it happens. It clearly happens.
It's like
building up to in our lifetime the Gulf War, building up to the Iraq War. It looks good to wave the flag. If you're not waving the flag, you must be a hippie. You're waving the flag, and you're getting on board for whatever's happening.
But nobody,
you're not asking where's this coming from?
Who sold you this tank? Who sold you these guns?
Who are these people?
And are we friends with this country, or are we not friends with them?
Are you really going to send all these people? What are the, so you can see?
That's part of the story.
That's what I think Lucas is brilliant at. I
there's
think
this undercurrent of war machines and war supplies that are being supplied by questionable means.
He's not picking a side on film. In real life, he may be, but he's not on film.
He also talks a lot about
just telling you it's out there.
The Commerce Guild and the Banking Guild.
Exactly.
So he kind of gives you the backstory of where money moves.
But we don't find that
out,
out,
obviously,
obviously,
money moves.
till the prequels.
Right.
But
it's very minimal, and it's an undercurrent. You have to dig. You can't just be a 10-year-old kid watching the movie and go, yeah, Dad, what's this Commerce Guild?
Which kind of is who the audience was. So assuming your son Kyle, he probably didn't pick up on that. He may be now because he's seeing Clone Wars and stuff. But when he first saw the prequels, he probably didn't because he was the audience. We did.
Right.
So that makes it, as much as everybody hates the prequels, you would think, that makes it genius because there are these levels.
He's giving you...
And when we do things like this to analyze it, and there's people who've analyzed it even deeper than us, they're actually pretty good. It's an actually pretty good story. And it's too bad we can't get into it as much.
All right, well, this gets us to how the clones are developed. They're ready to fight. They're fighting. Everything's there. Now, we know that at a certain point, because we saw the film, the clones are going to turn on the Jedi by seemingly the flick of a switch, more or less. A certain code word is given by Sidious, the Emperor, and they all, at least the way we see it in the film, turn on the Jedi.
And it's not like they do anything drastic. They're just allegiances change. Where the Jedi were their generals, now the Jedi are their enemy. That's simple.
Here's the big questions that I had the second I saw the film. Is this order a psychological trigger, or is this order something that they train and practice in case of a militaristic coup that could be anybody? It could be the Jedi, it could be this group, that group, whatever group, or is this more like a Manchurian candidate?
An
I must obey my thing,
order.
which is completely an unavoidable scenario. You cannot say no to that order.
I would like to think it was an indoctrination based on how we've seen the characters evolve through the Clone War animation.
But that's the problem right there. When we saw the movie, we didn't have the Clone Wars
We don't
backstory.
have that as reference.
Now, if we move to the Clone Wars story, we're starting to see around these last 3-4 seasons that there's little differences here.
Individualism.
These guys, a lot of them are, by the book, we must follow orders, we're bred to be clones, fight. Okay, we get it. But every now and then we get storylines where we're introduced to characters who don't follow orders. Some of them are bad guys. Some of them are not bad guys. They just don't like something and they're not going to do it.
And some of them just try different means than what they
to achieve
were
the same.
taught.
Right.
And we've seen episodes on how they train. And there was a particular group, I don't remember if they probably had a code name or a group name, and they had to go through this battle test and they kept failing, almost to the point where they're going to get drummed out, I don't know what that means. Do they become cooks or do they just get executed? But eventually they're thinking that the things they did differently was actually a benefit to that group because we've seen them now later, that same group as they've been on the battlefield.
Right.
And those are the guys that use, three-dimensional thinking. They use outside-the-box thinking, if you want to call it that, and they wind up being successful.
Well, this brings us to the end of part 1 of our Anatomy of a Stormtrooper special. Please join us again next week when we will continue discussing this subject with James. Until then, see you next time on Geekfest Rants. Bye-bye.
This is about more than just following orders. It is about honor. Where is the honor in marching blindly to our deaths? It is not our call. We are part of something larger. We are not independent of one another. I'm sorry, I cannot just follow orders when I know they're wrong. Especially when lives are at stake. You will if you support the system we fight for. I do support it. I do. But I am not just another number. None of us are. What are you doing here? You're a clone. So, I see the war has finally made its way out here. And I guess I can expect a visit from some droids soon. What's your number and rank? My name is LeQuain. Cut LeQuain. And I'm just a simple farmer. You're a deserter. Well, I like to think I'm merely exercising my freedom to choose. To choose not to kill for a living. That is not your choice to make. You swore an oath to the Republic. You have a duty. I have a duty, you're right. But it's to my family. Does that count, or do you still plan to turn me in? Do I have a choice?
Stop.